Hello everyone, today I'm going to talk about a few news concerning SpaceX and its last launch yesterday and the Falcon Heavy announcements. First of all, yesterday's launch was by many people mistaken for a UFO or North Korean missile or whatever. Uh, Many people not knowing what was going on were very concerned about the exhaust plume staying visible in the sky. And this actually happens pretty regularly, though not always. And of course, now some people who do know what's going on might still be wondering why this launch, and there are a few conditions that have to be met here. Now, for once, yesterday's launch was from Vandenberg, not from Cape Canaveral. And that is a bit of a factor because Vandenberg does launch a bit less frequently than Cape Canaveral, so the people living nearby are less used to seeing rocket launches, and it's also more of a commercial and military spaceport and has less of a NASA presence, so everyone knows that there's a spaceport at Cape Canaveral and there's a NASA visitor center and everyone knows that there's rockets launching from there. Vandenberg Air Force Base, to those who aren't really into spaceflight, is not that well known. The reason for that, of course, goes even deeper. That is, Vandenberg Air Force Base is geographically more optimally positioned for a polar orbit launch because of range clearance. The US launch operations are usually conducted out over sea because they don't have huge uninhabited areas like the Russians. So they prefer launching out over sea, and Cape Canaveral has of course, an east coast, so you can launch eastwards into a normal low Earth orbit or into a geostationary orbit and launch out over sea. And Vandenberg is a more southern coast. It's on the west coast, but it's directed more southern in that very area. And so it's more useful for launching into polar orbits, which is where the Iridium satellites and other modern communication satellites are to some degree launched. Another contributing factor was that these were launched into a plane that, at this time of the year, required that the rocket launched just after sunset. And just after sunset and just before sunrise is a very interesting time for watching the sky because that's when you can, for example, see the ISS passing over because it is higher up, so it has a further horizon. So just after sunset or just before sunrise, the ISS can pass over you, and the ISS is still in the sunlight, but you are not. So it's a great contrast because you see the dark night sky, but the ISS is being illuminated by the sun, and the same can happen for rocket exhaust or contrails, essentially, that are at very high altitudes. And so you had this huge glowing cloud that was visible much longer than usual because, yeah, rocket exhaust does stay in the air for a pretty long time. It just becomes close to invisible relatively quickly as it cools down. However, and it also thins out. However, if it is illuminated by the sun in a dark sky, it gets a lot more contrast and thus is much better visible also over a longer time. So yeah, a lot of news hype happened and lots of people wondering what was going on and learning that it was a rocket launch. And I can already tell you, next time someone launches into a polar orbit from the US just after sunset, the same people will probably be wondering what is going on again. Moving on, yesterday's launch was a little bit weird because it did not land, and there is a bit of theorizing as to why exactly in the spaceflight community they haven't released an exact statement why. Of course, the first assumption would be that obviously they didn't have enough fuel, but they needed the same amount of delta V. It's a low Earth orbit, and they're carrying the same amount of payload as with previous Iridium satellites. It's really not a very energy intensive launch. It's a low Earth orbit launch, and so they could have landed the rocket fuel-wise. They have already confirmed that as well. However, they did also re-enter it and do some re-entry tests so that they simply improve their track record and learn more and get a bit more experience with re-entering rocket stages, but they then just didn't land it and just let it fall into the ocean. And probably there were several contributing factors here. One is that with the very successful reusability of SpaceX, they are now having quite a few first stages in their hangar. And also this was a slightly outdated first stage compared to the other reused first stages they have in their hangar. And so it kind of makes sense that it's not quite as valuable as other first stages. This alone doesn't seem like a very valid reason. As I said, they did conduct re-entry tests, so they might as well want to conduct a landing test. And just because it's slightly outdated and they have a few, I'm not sure if that really justifies just smashing it into the sea. But in addition, it was also difficult to get a drone ship there. SpaceX only has so many drone ships, they need them in different locations, and the weather wasn't that great, and they couldn't get it to the west coast in the right time, so they would have had to scrub the launch, and that wasn't really worth it because it was an outdated stage. So these factors probably contributed together, and that might explain why they didn't land it. It was, however, not a failure, as very well indicated by the fact that if you were watching the live stream, there was that timeline of scheduled events, and even before launch, that never showed a planned landing. So it wasn't a failure, it was really just a bit of unfortunate planning, and they didn't really manage and didn't really care that much to reuse that stage. The theory that they can only reuse stages that often and this was essentially burnt out is also somewhat discarded because this was only previously flown once, and the COS-13 stage had been reused more often, and yet they did land the COS-13 stage to reuse it again later. Another short fun fact, of course, is that there were actually 3 rocket launches happening yesterday, 2 of them within 1 minute of each other, uh, more or less coincidentally, because the launches were both into heavily inclined low Earth orbits, but in very different orbital planes. However, since the 2 spaceports were in completely different locations, that just happened to match up to the same time of day, and they launched within almost exactly 1 minute of each other. The Yaxa H2A launched I think it was 61 seconds before the Falcon 9, depending on where you set the point of launch, if you count by ignition or liftoff. The Falcon 9 carried 10 Iridium internet communication satellites to provide internet to mobile applications like airplanes or ships, and the H2A launched 2 research satellites, one actual use satellite for monitoring climate change, and one experimental satellite for testing an ion engine in low Earth orbit. And I do have a video of the 2 launches lined up, synchronized in their timeline, so it's basically in real time the launches happening within a minute of each other. I could, of course, only live stream one of the launches. I did choose the SpaceX launch because it got a lot more interest, but I did later upload footage of both launches. And then 2 hours later, a Chinese rocket launched another Earth observation satellite. But now let's move on to the Falcon Heavy news, which are a little bit older, but again, as I had previously stated in another video, I don't have that much time, so I didn't get to make a video about that before, but now I'll just mention it in this video. Yes, pictures of the connected core stages of the Falcon Heavy test have been released. Earlier this year, footage of a static firing test of these stages has been released. Yes, they are planning to launch a cherry red Tesla Roadster into space. Where exactly isn't exactly released either. it's supposedly a Mars-related orbit, but it's probably not actually gonna go into Mars orbit, but rather onto a home and transfer orbit and then go fly closely by Mars and then stay in that Sun orbit. Yes, at first everyone thought it was a joke, but it really makes some amount of sense. They do have to launch something for the test launch, and launching an actual space probe on the first test launch on a rocket doesn't seem like a very wise idea. And so it made sense to choose some kind of payload that wasn't really that important, and it's funny, so why not? Other space agencies don't really take funny for a reason, and they often tend to send concrete blocks and such as first dummy tests, and that doesn't really seem to make much more sense either, so I see no problem with that. They've also released images of the Roadster in the integration building being encased into the fairing and mounted onto some sort of adapter. I'm not entirely sure how they connected that. Apparently they modified the car to have some sort of connection mechanism on its under bottom, because usually cars don't come with a space launch connection system at their floor, but they seem to have modified that in, built a basic adapter, and now they can mount it to a Falcon rocket. More interestingly, they are going to reuse all three core stages. The outer ones are going to boost back and land at Cape Canaveral. During the CRS-13 launch, we could already see in the landing camera of the stage actually that there's a second landing pad already prepared, so that's pretty cool. And the center core stage is going to land on a drone ship out at sea. So they're really gonna combine and show us everything they can do, which is pretty cool if it goes well, and, well, it's a test flight, so if it doesn't go well, then that's okay too. The launch date has been set to in about a month. It will probably still be pushed back a day or two. This happens in spaceflight. Usually when a launch is still a month away, it's still going to be postponed by 1 or 2 days. But it seems to be set for early next year, and it's probably not going to get scrapped for another few months or even for a year. It is probably launching in January 2018. And while they are not going to reuse the upper stage, the typical Falcon second stage, in this case the third stage, which was speculated on a while, but that will probably be a bit too much new development for this first test launch. They are probably going to try reusing the fairings, and it seems pretty certain right now that the mysterious ship that had been spotted will probably in some way contribute catching the fairings using some sort of net or towel essentially spanned between these long beams, which makes a lot of sense, not as a very clever catching mechanism. You don't have to imagine it falling in free fall and then being caught by a net, but they will come down on parachutes. But first of all, you don't want to land things right in the sea. Salt water is incredibly dangerous for high-tech materials, and if you want to reuse it, you'd better launch it on land it on some sort of platform or net. And you can save on parachutes because that net, while it wouldn't catch it from terminal velocity, it can catch them from a bit higher velocity than they would be capable of landing at on solid ground. So you can use smaller parachutes which leave them falling a little bit faster, which of course saves weight for the overall rocket. The mysterious Zuma launch is still set for January 4th or 5th officially, but it will probably be delayed for another few days as well. Apart from that, there's not much more going on, but I think those are already pretty exciting months now with SpaceX and their new Falcon Heavy rocket. I will try to cover and also maybe more deeply analyze any further details that come up, and live stream the more important events like the Falcon Heavy test flight. And as always, thanks for watching.